Marian and I are supposed to say random things to each other now to prove that we are here.
Yes, we are here.
As women come in. That's right.
So radical feminist perspectives. And
yes,
we have Sheila Jeffreys this morning, who is going to talk about her 2005 book, Beauty and Misogyny. And looks like it's 5, so we'll get started. Why did you write that book? What prompted that in 2005 to just write Beauty and Misogyny? Where did that come from?
Well, back in the 1970s and 80s, of course, when I became a radical feminist, I became a lesbian. There was a huge critique of beauty practices, and women gave up beauty practices. Lesbians and heterosexual women just gave it up. You know, we cut our hair, we gave up wearing makeup, we gave up wearing skirts for the large part, we gave up depilation, we certainly wore flat shoes, and so on. We just gave up all those practices which we considered were practices of subordination, and they're practices which are usually called femininity and therefore assumed to be natural to women. But our understanding, radical feminist understanding of what femininity is and masculinity is that femininity is the behavior of a subordination. So what femininity means is that women must take up very little space and keep their knees together. They must smile all the time at men, smiles of deference. Don't hit me, I'm going to be nice. They should wear clothes that make men sexually excited and that are potentially crippling. The shoes are crippling. Whereas masculinity is the behavior of the ruling class. It's the behavior of dominance. Men can take up space. They wear loose, comfortable clothing that hides their body. Their feet are on the ground. They wear clothing that bespeaks dignity and high social status. And so I wrote the book because I was very aware that there'd been a huge backlash because women had made various advances into the public world. The restrictions on what women could wear and the way women could behave became very, very extreme. And by the early 2000s, I was aware that there were monstrously high heels. I saw women falling down in the street around me in Melbourne, where I lived at the time. It was just an absolutely ridiculous situation. And I couldn't believe that we'd got to that there'd been such a severe backlash that now women were being severely crippled. And so that's what really prompted me to write this book, to try and say, look, you know, there was some sanity. There was a radical feminist analysis and practice around beauty practices just a couple of decades ago. What on earth is happening here? And so I wrote the book really to show that women could change and to encourage women to reject the practices that cemented and showed and demonstrated their inferior status. I realize that saying this now is kind of strange because the critique's not out there. It's really completely been disappeared by now. So some women may be thinking, just a minute, how can you criticize makeup and so on? But we'll talk about that later on. But what I'd like to do now is just look at some photos. Joe, could you show the photos? Okay, so I'd just like to go through some photographs showing what women are expected to wear now. And I mean, they're not extreme. This is just the clothing of elite women and to show the distinction from men. So here, you know that there's a huge distinction between women and men. That is very, very clear in the clothing. So the main reason for the clothing women have to wear versus men is to show that we are a different class, to point out who we are in relation to men. There mustn't be any kind of confusion. But the clothing and the appearance is, of course, the clothing and appearance of subordination. That's terribly important. So you see here that both women are wearing high heels. We've got Brigitte Macron here, and we've got Carrie Simmons, Boris's wife. Brigitte has lost her name. I don't know whether Carrie is going to lose her name, because of course women lose their names in marriage. But in terms of the costume, we've got long blonde hair, which services men's hair fetishism. Women are supposed to bleach their hair and have it long. We've got extremely high heels, which are crippling. The women could not walk or run or do any of those things in these heels. The legs will have to be depilated. Indeed, the women will usually have to depilate the whole of their bodies, because very often these days women have to show their tops of their arms, which means their armpits are bare. and so on. Whereas, of course, the men are in loose suits. There is a disadvantage for men, which is that the clothing is often of very boring colors, and men can get fed up with suits, but it is the clothing of dignity. The men have short hair, they do not have makeup, they can walk, their feet are on the ground and so on. So they have the clothing of superior social status, comfortable status. Although, yes, I would like them to be able to wear other colors if they wanted to. Can we have the next picture, Joe? Okay, in this picture, we have Jill Biden as well in terrible shoes. And of course, she's showing her legs, naked legs, and because women are supposed to wear skirts to make their legs visible, men like to see parts of women's bodies. And I know that Jill Biden is a woman of considerable considerable talents, but the fact is she has to have long blonde hair and high-heeled shoes, just like other women do, to show her inferior status. And I mean, I find it absolutely extraordinary to look at these pictures and look at the difference between what the men are wearing and what the women are wearing. But it seems so natural. It's just sort of, nobody takes any notice of it. People just don't see the most blooming obvious thing on the television outside the door everywhere right now. Okay, can we have the next picture? Okay, now the problem for women in public life is, and the reason that this clothing is very undignified, is that, for instance, the shoes can come off. This is Julia Gillard, first and only Prime Minister of Australia in 2012. And I admired Julia very much for many, many things, but I did not admire what she had to wear. And here she's had to be ushered out and away from a demonstration. It was now a demonstration for Aboriginal rights, and she lost a shoe, and therefore she actually has to be carried by the security detail. Now, this is not dignified, and there is no way that men would ever have to do this. So the possibilities of women in public life to have authority and dignity are hugely reduced by the requirement that they demonstrate their inferior status. Could we have the next picture? This is Julia Gillard losing her shoe again. She's coming down from a stage and she's losing her shoe. This is number 2. Could we have the third picture? I know it's a bad picture, but there aren't better ones. This is Julia Gillard flat on her face on a lawn. She's visiting India, and her shoe got stuck in the lawn and she's fallen flat on her face. Now, this is just absolutely shocking. It breaks my heart that a woman, and a good woman, manages to get to be Prime Minister of Australia, but this is what happens to her. Could we have the next picture? Okay, in terms of women, elite women in public life and what they have to wear, this is Cathy Newman, the main presenter, the very first woman to present the news on Channel 4, which is an important channel that is normally seen as slightly more progressive than the BBC. She wears shocking shoes. I didn't get pictures of her red shoes because I couldn't find one of them, but she wears skirts, of course. She shows her arms, and she will have to be doing all of that depilation. She must show parts of the body to make men excited. And could we have the next picture? And this is the long hair. This is Helia Ebrahimi. She's the economics correspondent of Channel 4, and her hair is it used to be even longer than this. So what you notice when she's presenting is the hair. And the hair is of course enforced upon women because of men's hair fetishism. They're very excited by hair, and it's very difficult, I think, I also think long hair is very unhygienic and very difficult to care for, and all of those things. But it does satisfy men's sexual interests. But I think it's very difficult to have the same authority and dignity in public life as this is you have to be like. And of course, she has to, very often these women with this long hair have to buy hair extensions that have been pretty much stolen from women who donated in temples in India and so on and so on. So for women in public life right now, the imposition of harmful beauty practices is extraordinarily severe. And if I just mention Angela Merkel, because of course she has now resigned, but of course she didn't do any of these things. That was one of the wonderful things about her, and there are other things. But she wore dignified jackets, she wore trousers, she wore flat shoes, and of course that caused Berlusconi to say of her that she was a fat, uneffable cunt. So this gives an idea of the pressure on women in politics and why it's necessary, well, why they may feel it's necessary to wear really, really harmful clothes and harmful practices. So that's why I wrote the book. That's the kind of the underlying message.
I'm sorry, I vacated for a minute, and you're getting, and I got on my phone, which is why you're seeing two of me. There's a lot that's happened. I know, computer issues. There's a lot that's happened in the interim. It's been like 15 plus years now. What's changed? What's the biggest change?
Well, there was a new edition of the book in 2014, and I wrote a new introduction at that time. I mean, the good thing about it is that the book was being taught in a lot of classes in American universities, which is brilliant, really. So they had a new edition. And the main thing that I changed in the book was to add a section in my chapter on mutilation of women, a section on the barbarity of breast implants, because around that time, from about 2012, it was becoming clear, in Britain in particular, that there were terrible, terrible industrial substances in the breast implants. These were leaking, was leading to terrible, terrible harms to women, and there were class actions and so on. So I wrote a section on the absolute barbarity of the practice of putting these industrial chemicals into women's bodies. But since then, I would say, in the years since 2014 even, there's been an escalation of the practices. There's torturously high shoes, more and more common in public life, as I was just showing in the photographs. And things just go from bad to worse, really. I've also noticed in the last couple of years that in popular culture, the pornographication of popular culture, and I have a chapter in the book on porno chic, where I talk about how all the values of pornography come out to create fashion, create what happens in music and popular culture and so on. And I've noticed what's happening with female rap stars, for instance, such as Megan Thee Stallion in the US. They are basically dressed as strippers. They have their buttocks on display. They have torturing shoes. But of course, the male rappers do not have any of that, as befits members of the working class, of the ruling class, rather. So the pornographication of culture, I think, is much worse. And indeed, buttocks seem to be, at the moment, the main focus. If I look at my local beach, there's women who take out canoes with their boyfriends, and the boyfriends have nice loose shorts down to the knee, and the women have what appear to be thongs up between their buttocks. So they are on display, and their buttocks are on display. I mean, things do change. I can remember that at one time, a few years ago, women were supposed to show their cleavage. They would have to show their breasts, and that was crucially important. I remember going to the Spanish Parliament on a visit, I think about 2005, and meeting with women MPs, and it was difficult for me to look at them because their breasts were mainly on display. But that was breasts that came out of the top of their garments. Now it's breasts coming out of the bottom. There are breasts sort of falling out. That seems to be the thing of the moment. Breasts fall out of the bottom of a garment. So there have been changes, but mostly it's about an exacerbation and escalation.
There's a wide range. This is something that really is a spectrum in a way of how severe some of these practices are. So, you know, from starting with, I don't know, maybe wearing lipstick, or, you know, I have earrings. And I debated whether or not to wear them. The differences in severity of the harmful practices, does that, or should it inform political or policy change or efforts? Does that matter?
The severity of the practices. I don't know. I think some of the practices are extraordinarily severe. I think breast implants are extraordinarily severe. Cutting up women's bodies and placing things under their flesh is about as horrifying as you get, but that has been completely normalized. So I think in terms of how society sees these things, that horrifying practice is seen as ordinary and there's no great fuss about it. So I'm not sure it's about the severity of the practices, but it's true that most of the practices that I write about in the book are completely everyday practices. The section on breast implants and mutilation is towards the end. So I do write about high-heeled shoes, which of course are completely normal, but cause terrible crippling injuries to women's bodies and spine and falling over and so on. I talk about makeup, which is an absolutely everyday practice, but of course there's terribly harmful chemicals in the makeup that go into the skin. I talk in the book about black hair dye, which can cause cancer and so on. So a lot of the practices are harmful, but I also talk in the book about how the putting on of the makeup, I think there was some study from Marks and Spencer's at the time about how much time in a woman's life putting on makeup took, and they reckoned it was about 20 minutes ordinarily, but for going out it might be 45. And I reckon that was about 4 years out of a woman's life, because I added it all up. And as I often said to students, that's enough time to learn Korean or do something useful in life. So yes, I did mostly talk about the absolutely everyday stuff, depilation, for instance. I'm not sure that the severity is the crucial thing, although some of the practices at the moment are very, very severe. We have this problem in this country of women, young women under the age of 18 can just say what they are older or whatever, but they go into there's no laws about it. They go into these practitioners on any high street and they get Botox and fillers put into their faces. It's causing some terrible, terrible problems, and there is a campaign to get some legal antidote to this, but it's all about, are they 18 or are they not 18? The actual practices in themselves are not being outlawed. States never seem to think that they should actually change or limit the terrible practices that are done to women's bodies.
I mean, the reason I ask is because there's and you talk about this in your book about the underlying reason why any of these practices exist, from something as seemingly benign as organic lipstick to all the way to female genital mutilation, that the root is the same. And I mean, there's a conversation going on in the chat now about long hair, and how do you respond and how do you explain the analysis, the radical feminist analysis of these practices when women are saying, why do you want to interfere with me, wearing makeup, wearing heels if I think it looks good, growing my hair? I mean,
Yeah.
where do you start explaining how your analysis informs a response to that?
Yes, I'm very aware that women will say, well, I choose to do this. It makes me feel good. I don't do it for men. I heard all of those arguments at the time. And one of the things that I tend to say is, well, then why don't men do them? We know that men do them, but only transvestites who are sexually excited, because they know that the practices are demeaning and degrading, and they get the excitement, therefore, from doing those practices and feeling the degradation on themselves. So those are the only men who choose to do it. I mean, if it's so marvelous to do all of these things, why aren't men out there routinely in the makeup and the high-heeled shoes and with the hair down to their waists and so on? They don't seem to be as enthusiastic about it as women. So what I chose to do to frame the book, to get away from all of this choosy arguments, was to frame it in the understanding of harmful cultural practices, because I was teaching international politics at the time. And I was very aware that women's human rights theorists were seeking to include in human rights understandings practices which didn't obviously fit into ordinary human rights norms and conventions. The main one that they were trying to include was female genital mutilation, which they then classified as a harmful cultural practice to explain why it was unacceptable. And they talked about, in terms of their definitions of harmful cultural practices, they said that harmful cultural practices were they were defined. The first thing was they were harmful for women and girls. They were done to women and girls, as all these beauty practices are. They were harmful to women and girls because they harm health, and that's obviously true of a lot of the practices we're talking about. They were justified by tradition, And in fact, of course, in terms of makeup, and as I explain in the book, makeup, at least in Britain, was, actually pretty recent, but it is justified by tradition. But, my mother, when she was growing up, makeup wasn't acceptable in her working class community, and she had to learn to do it rather late and didn't do it very well. But it's justified by tradition. They've been taking place for generations, supposedly, harmful cultural practices. They're the result of women's low status, and they are for the benefit of men. And I thought, yes, great. All of these things absolutely fit these practices we're talking about. So it doesn't really matter whether you think you've chosen it or not. The practices are culturally enforced. Women are raised to do them. They're seen as absolutely normal. They're compulsory for women involved in heterosexual coupling and for special occasions. And they're enforced in most workplaces upon women. So really, they are cultural practices. And so discussion about choice, well, it doesn't work. Also, the UN document on harmful cultural practices says they persist because they are not questioned and take on an aura of morality in the eyes of those practicing them. And I think that's certainly true as well for all of these harmful practices. They're absolutely seen as normal and an ordinary thing to do. I can see a bit of what's going on in the chat. And yes, I can understand the stuff about, it can be hard to do your hair and doesn't it cost money? Why don't men have to think about these things? I mean, why haven't these men got long hair for exactly the same reasons as are being advanced in the chat here? So I think that's interesting. And the other thing about the harmful cultural practices analysis is that the women's human rights theorists who are creating these documents for the UN and putting out these ideas about what was problematic about harmful cultural practices, they did, as I say, start with female genital mutilation. They never, ever included the West. So it was only women in countries where they didn't have much education or many opportunities that they saw women being forced to engage in these practices. And of course, there are many, many, many of them that we could talk about. But in the West, it was assumed. In fact, Martha Nussbaum, the very significant women's human rights theorist specifically, has written this. In the West, women have education, they have choice, they don't have to do these practices. And so she even says that dieting practices and anorexia are not serious problems because women can choose them, despite the fact that 1 in 10 women who are anorexic do die of this practice. So they tended to see Western countries as places where women had choice. The practices were done by the medical profession, of course, as all the terrible mutilations of the breasts are. And they were seen often as a peak of culture, because in the West, ballet, women dancing in pain, for instance, is seen as a peak of culture, as of course are the incredibly high-heeled shoes on the elite women that we have been looking at in the photographs. So distinctions were made, and I said, and the book actually says, let us not make those distinctions. I want to carry that analysis over of what is harmful to women to look at what women in the West, the vast majority of them, do every day to themselves. I mean, the vast majority of women, for instance, depilate, which is a horrifying practice when you think of it, most parts of their bodies.
You mentioned, men don't do this and some men choose to do this. And you included a book on transvestites, transsexuals, transgender. I mean, by that time, all those 3 terms were in use. Why did you put that back in there back in 2005? And it's changed now. There are things that have changed now.
Yes. Well, when I wrote the book, yes, it was before I was aware of the way in which the issue of transvestite rights would actually take over the culture and politics and so on. I wasn't so aware then of what was going to happen. But what I was aware of, I was finding online all of these websites where men were trained to do the practices. So there were, often they were trained by prostituted women to do the practices. It was a sort of useful little earner for women who'd been in prostitution and pornography to create these studios where basically it was a sexual excitement for men to go and have to wear high-heeled shoes and have lipstick put on them and so on. And there were training programs, there were video training programs and so on. But what was fascinating about all of this was it showed very much what was exciting for the men about it, which it was obviously clearly sexual. It was about sexual masochism. The men knew very well that the practices were degrading. So that was one reason for having the chapter, was to show that men do the practices because they're degrading and the practices of the subordinate class. Surely this would help women reading the book to understand why these practices are not just natural or choice, but actually a practice that's embedded in a politics, a hierarchy of power. And the other reason that I wanted to include that chapter is because if men can learn to do these things and do them reasonably successfully, even though they often look absurd, it shows that actually it's not just women who can do them. Men can do these things. You know, there are special high-heeled shoes that men can buy from special high-heeled shoe shops. And so, you know, I wanted to show that the practices are socially constructed. Men can learn it. For instance, the online training sessions would say to men that when you sit down, it's important to keep your legs together or cross your legs, because that shows powerlessness. They were absolutely straightforward and outright about this. That's about powerlessness. Women must not take up space. So I just thought it was lovely the way they actually mapped into these training programs the explicit creation of degradation and powerlessness through the practices. And I really thought that would be helpful for women to know. But of course, since that time, since 2005, certainly when I first published the book, there's been huge changes, and the rights of these men who are sexually excited by the practices have become a supposedly huge social justice movement. And the right for men to wear these high-heeled shoes because they enjoy the pain has become seen as a human right, which now threatens the erasure of women, as we know. Yes, I can see that Joe is saying in the chat, and I should perhaps mention this, that in Korea, there is a wonderful movement against harmful beauty practices. And I was lucky enough to go and speak there in 2019 in October to promote a Korean version of Gender Hurts. And I was able to lecture in rooms where I'd look out over a sea of women with lovely short hair, dressed in really nice, sensible ways. It was wonderful. You wouldn't see that here. I mean, you couldn't. When I think about who I lectured at university, almost all the women had long hair. So they had short hair. They were rejecting the practices, particularly, I think, because in Korea, the Gangnam district of Seoul is the very center of beauty practice tourism, self-mutilation tourism in Southeast Asia in general. Women go there from all over the world. There are loads and loads. I walked through it, and there's loads and loads and loads of supposed cosmetic surgery hospitals where women have terrible mutilations done to their bodies. And in fact, a couple of the young women I met there and talked with about these practices, one of the young women explained that one of the things that happens is that teenage girls can go into these supposed hospitals and clinics, and they will have Botox injected into their muscles. Men don't like muscles. And once the Botox has been injected into their muscles, the muscles don't stand out. The women look sort of flat, like you know, fish, I suppose, really. This particular young woman said that it was now very difficult for her to walk very far, very difficult to run, and it was done to her as a teenager. So South Korea is an absolute hub of these most horrifying practices against women, and it's a massive, massive, massive industry, of course. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's been such a big backlash against it. And it's wonderful that there has been such a backlash. But what's interesting to me is that in Australia, in Britain, in America, there is not this backlash of feminists against the imposition of these practices. This absolutely hasn't happened here. And that's a puzzle to me, that it's very, very difficult in these countries in the West to talk about the problems of these practices, whereas in South Korea, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of women getting involved in this wonderful movement against these harms.
You know, one of the ways that I try and talk about class analysis to women, or to explain it, is to talk about being in a POW camp. You're either one of the guards or you're one of the prisoners, and that's it. You're either the oppressed or the oppressors. And women are just like, but I have agency, I can decide. Yeah, as a prisoner, you can decide to do things to make your life easier, to make it feel like you're not in prison, to make your life easier there. You can, have sex with the guards, you can maybe put on makeup, you can do a whole lot of things, you can make decisions, but every single decision is in the context of being a prisoner. And I think in the West, in a lot of the Western countries, 50, 60, 70 years ago, we were still very, very much prisoners. Couldn't work outside the home, except in very few jobs, couldn't have a bank account. I think women who are in countries where they still really recognize, I'm in prison, it makes it easier for them to recognize these practices, among other things, keeping them in prison, and that they really are in prison. And I think that Western women have lost the sense that that all the decisions they're making are in the context of being one of the prisoners and never one of the guards. So women in the West will say and will ask, is it ever appropriate, or what situation can I just do these things and it's okay? And it's not a question of like, you have permission or you don't have permission. It's where it's coming from. It's why are you making that decision? And I find that the hardest thing to get across to women in the West now, because there's no sense anymore of like, yeah, we're in a POW camp.
That's right.
My concern is, I'm a physician, so I'm really concerned about a lot of the more harmful practices, surgeries and things like that. And you talk about that in your book. Were you horrified by what you found about surgeries, or was there anything that you came across and you said, oh my God, this is so much worse than I thought?
I mean, you're horrified about this particularly because you are medically trained. So yes, the surgeries are a particular problem. Now, the way I came at this was to talk about self-mutilation by proxy. And I've written quite a bit about this because I was very concerned about this. In 2001, I think I wrote my original piece on body art and social status, where I was starting to look at the explosion of an industry of body art, much of which was simply about tattooing, piercing, putting piercings in, cutting, and so on. And I was very horrified by what was being done. And so I explained that the self-mutilation by proxy had similarities with self-mutilation, not by proxy, of course, which is that persons who are of a degraded social status are more likely to do harm to themselves. So, of course, girls and women engage in cutting, which is a serious medical problem. But then this had been, in the early 2000s, this was transformed into a massive industry. And so that you've got cutting studios on every corner. And what I understood self-mutilation by proxy to cover was the piercing, putting objects into the body. I mean, there was a point in the early 2000s when I would sometimes have students come into my for a supervision who had so much metal junk in the face that it was really quite hard to look at them. I think that's not quite as popular now. But I tried to explain that the cutting, piercing, and tattooing was that women seeking out others to do the harm to them. It was done in sadomasochism as well. Tops in sadomasochism would do these harms, but not be paid. As I understood it, cosmetic surgery was simply a part of the self-mutilation by proxy. Women in the underclass would go to practitioners to do these terrible practices to them, as indeed young women now are going to have their breasts removed, which is the extremely harmful practice du jour, I think it's fair to say. So yes, I needed an analysis, and self-mutilation by proxy was the one I chose to look at all of these practices that were going on at the time. But I don't know what more to say about how horrifying. I was horrified at the time. I was looking at body mutilation sites on the internet, and there were huge numbers of them, and I presume that there are still huge numbers of them. And there were women having their skins flayed on their back, having extraordinary things done to their bodies, and it was mostly women who were having those things done. And there were communities online where women who were self-mutilators in this form were seeking partners. Some of them, quite a few of them, were women suffering from disabilities who were also getting mutilated in this way. So yes, that horrified me. But what I wanted to do was join that up with the cosmetic surgery and with the cutting alone in their room, and show generally how these practices were being carried out on a subordinate group.
One of the disturbing things, and you made reference to it in your book in a couple of places, is all of these things in reference to how it pleases or doesn't please men, including gay men who are like fashion designers. I mean, I had a laugh when you talked about, Carrie Bradshaw's Manolo Blahnik in Sex and the City, Sarah Jessica Parker, and that gay men's involvement in fashion and what it does to women is very heavily misogynistic. The trans cult now, making hyper femininity the apotheosis of being a woman, is very, very heavily misogynistic, and oddly enough, those guys get it probably more than the gay men do. So what's disturbing is when people talk about, well, you say we can have this, but we can't have this, that it's all really in relation to how we're programmed to want men to see us. And when you're talking about any practice like, well, we shouldn't have long hair, we should have short hair, but we shouldn't shave our legs, we should shave our legs. It's not the specific practice itself, although some of them are horrifying, that it's the reason we're doing it is because it pleases men. And you talk early on in your book about men's sexual excitement fueling these practices. And I don't think women think about that. How do you talk about that some more? Because I found that a really interesting way to start the book. It's like, yeah, it's all about the sexual excitement.
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I found really interesting was a book from the 1930s in in which a sexologist or psychologist is talking about the excitement of women wearing high-heeled shoes. And he talks about the importance of why women need to wear high-heeled shoes is that men can go into the first stages of arousal when they hear the tap of the heels on the pavement. So, I mean, that was kind of extraordinary. And that was a psychologist writing that. So I think women are not very aware of the extent to which the things that they have to do to themselves are actually providing sexual excitement for men. And I think I wrote about it in the book as being basically like a sort of outdoor brothel. The women are required to fashion themselves to appeal to all the different aspects of male sexuality, all the different fetishes that men have, the high heels and the long hair and so on, are requirements on women's bodies so they can have this sexual excitement, so that they can go into the first stages of arousal at any time when they're just walking down the street and outside, and the women are on display for them. So yes, I think that the men's sexual excitement in all of this is very important. There were also, I found websites online where men would talk about how they got their girlfriends to depilate, because when I was writing the book, it was not inevitable that women had to shave their vulvas. It is in some cultures, but it wasn't generally in the West, but it was just coming in. And I remember sitting in a classroom with my MA students, mostly women, and talking about this and saying, did they know about this? And that was just before I wrote the book, I think. And all of them had shaved their vulvas. All of these young women 20, 21 years old. And I thought, oh my God, what has happened? There's been an extraordinary cultural change. And of course, this is enormously painful and difficult. But online, I found these groups of men talking about how they got their girlfriends to do it and how sexually exciting it was to sexually use women who didn't have any hair in their genital area. And it was the time of the Brazilian wax and so on. So yes, I managed to find on the internet groups of men discovering all of these things, discussing all of these things as routine ways in which they were very excited and pleased, that women, I think, really didn't have any understanding of.
How much of that comes from pornography?
Well, a great deal of it comes from pornography, of course. And the interesting thing is I did have a chapter on porno chic in the book where I talk about how pornography creates culture, was creating culture. And the interesting thing was that in early pornography, apparently women did still have their pubic hair. So, you know, if it's 1970s pornography, when the industry was beginning, they would have their pubic hair. But then gradually it was necessary to see more and more clearly. So the women in pornography had their pubic hair removed. And then women generally were expected to have their pubic hair removed. And then women started to get more and more concerned about their genitals and whether they were the right shape. Women in pornography, of course, were having to cut their genitals. I think I maybe mentioned in the book that there was one porn star at the time who sold the bits of her labia that she'd had cut off for a good price. You know, that was an aspect of men's fetishism at the time. And so women started to have to change their labia more and make sure that they looked neat and looked beautiful. And then, of course, it moved to the anus. The anus is so important in pornography that the practice of anal bleaching began. I mean, it was lovely for me at the time that I was writing this book, because I had all these wonderful young women students in front of me in lectures, and I would say to them, what is the latest thing? And they would tell me, and we'd all fall about laughing. But I mean, it was extraordinary. I was amazed by anal bleaching at the time, whereas now I think it's perfectly ordinary anal bleaching, I presume pretty harmful. But since anal sex is absolutely normalized among young women, and in most pornography, it's absolutely central, because of course it's more degrading. The man gets a better victory if he has anally penetrated a woman. And as the sort of research on anal sex at the moment is saying, is that men don't gain much of a victory if they take a girl's virginity these days. I mean, what is it? I mean, nothing. Everybody does that. So they have to do the anal sex. But yes, it is so normal now that a young woman needs to make sure that her anus is respectable. So the pornography, the pornographication of culture created more and more harmful and oppressive beauty practices for women. I mean, when I grew up and became sexual, it wasn't necessary to beautify any parts of your genitals, anus, etc.
Somebody's loving my facial reactions. I'm sorry. I'm Italian. We're very passionate.
I mean, it would be nice to know how this is affecting young women now, but I mean, I don't know of any research where young women are being asked whether they do these practices, why they do these practices. It would be interesting to know, but I mean, it's not being followed along. There's not a lot of information about what's going on. And I don't have my lovely students to ask anymore because I'm retired, which in that sense is a shame.
Well, let me ask you a question that, and this may not be applicable to everybody, but I think there may be an interesting point to be made. Is it different if women are doing this for other women? I mean, if all of a sudden all men disappeared and we were all lesbians, and you know, A, would we want to do any of this for each other? And B, if we did put on lipstick for another woman, is that different? Does that make it different?
Well, there's a difference around sexuality, which is that fetishism is specifically male sexuality. So it is specifically men who are interested in the long hair and the high-heeled shoes and get sexually excited by all of those things. So women do not have fetishes of that kind. So they're unlikely to impose upon other women the doing of these practices for their own sexual delight. Also, I think that women probably don't think that women are as disgusting as men do. I mean, men obviously do think women are disgusting. Many of their paraphilias, perversions come from finding women's bodies and particularly women's genitals disgusting. So I think there is a lot of concentration on doing things to women's genitals. I don't actually think that women find their own genitals or each other as disgusting as men find us. So I don't think it would be quite the same. But of course, I am aware that there are lesbians who wear lipstick. I mean, this started happening really in the late 80s in particular, that beauty practices amongst lesbians, particularly lesbians who called themselves femme, perhaps we shouldn't even get into that, really started to come in, that women started doing some of these practices. I think a lot of it was about being able to get into the public world and getting advancement. And if you look like a perfectly ordinary lesbian who refuses to do the practices of degradation, it is harder to get out into the world. But I don't think it's necessarily because the women think that other women will find their eye makeup beautiful. I don't think that's what it's for. Or to create the baby face, you know, makeup is supposed to create the baby face, big eyes and so on, because men like to think of women as babies, which is one of the reasons they like to get rid of the pubic hair and all of that kind of stuff as well. Can't see that being a motivation.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think so either. When you get a group of women together, you know, in college dorms, after a while, by, you know, the middle of the semester, when there used to be, you know, men allowed in women's dorms, women would be just, you know, remarkably themselves and walk around with no makeup and eyeliner. So yeah, so I don't think it would be an issue. What has changed the most since you wrote this book? I mean, what is the, you know, the one or two sea changes that have really changed the most, that might make you emphasize something more, or might make you change something you wrote a little bit? Is there anything in particular?
I think now I would have written a chapter actually specifically on women in politics. I mean, I used to teach women in politics to my MA class, and I used to show them the pictures of Julia Gillard falling over, and I do talk about that in the new introduction to the 2014 edition. But I think the way in which women, elite women in public life, model these behaviors for women is a really important aspect of what's going on, and that's become much more severe. I think the wearing of high heels by women in public life is pretty horrifying. I mean, I watch Channel 4 News. It doesn't matter what news you watch, you are going to see women in extraordinarily high heels. You know they can't stand up in them. So you know that they go into the news studio and they either stand in one spot or they sit down with these shoes on. You know they'll take them off just to get out the room at the end of the program. And it's such extraordinary fetish behavior. So that's the stage where we've reached. And I think I probably didn't say enough about that in the book, and I would now, that the high heels of the elite are horrifying presently.
You know, I can see that. I work, when we're not teleworking, in an office setting, and virtually every single woman in the office has a at her desk has a drawer full of shoes. I mean, everybody wears sneakers and commuting shoes to go back and forth, and when they're at their desk during the day, they wear their comfortable shoes. But when they have to go to a meeting, we'll open that magic drawer of, you know, grown-up lady shoes. My niece used to call them when she was 2 years old. They'll open the drawer of grown-up lady shoes and put on the heels to go to the meeting. And the first thing they do when they get back to their desks is yank those shoes off. Nobody likes them. I mean, everybody hates them.
That's right. And I do say in the book that one of the fashion designers, Tom, what's his name, the women in the office, when he came to the office for his fashion firm, they all had to get the high-heeled shoes, stilettos, out of the drawer and put them on, because this gay man required them to wear those shoes. But of course, they would not at any other time. I can remember when I was a young woman on the tube in London being horrified to overhear the conversation of two women who were wearing high heels, and they were coming back from the office. and saying to each other they couldn't wait to get home, because when they got home, they got a big, washing up bowl full of warm water, and they put mustard in it, and they put their feet in it to try and get the pain out of their feet. And I think I was just, an early feminist at that time, thinking, what the hell? Why would anybody be doing this extraordinary stuff? So yes, the reign of the crippling, torturing shoes that make it impossible for women to walk is here. I think probably what I'd also put more in the book, and I have actually put it in the book that, no, I don't think I have actually in the one I've just finished, but we need to point out that women cannot run in these shoes. There have been several murders of women, one particularly in Melbourne a few years ago, where the fact that the women were wearing these shoes it contributed to the fact that men could simply grab them, rape them, and kill them. And women, women are not usually in a position to fight off men, but being able to run is crucially important. And the fact that we've got a whole class of persons, the underclass, walking around, particularly at night, places of entertainment, trying to get home, where anyway the streets are dangerous for women, in shoes they cannot possibly run in, often walking along, holding the shoes rather than walking in them, of course. This is a horrifying situation when we know how incredibly dangerous it is for women. So the connection of those shoes and the restrictive clothing of women generally, and how it makes them prey and even more vulnerable to male violence, I think I would probably cover that more.
Yeah, and it's pervaded popular culture when you talked about, the gay man and everyone in the office pulling out the high-heeled shoes when he walked in. There was a scene like that in The Devil Wears Prada, where when she walked in, all the women, and this is a high, fashion magazine and everything, they took off their comfortable shoes and they pulled on the high heels. So
they don't wear them for themselves.
You think? So what do we do? I mean, how do we reach women? What do you say to women that's just like, I think I look better in these, I wear them for myself? How do you,
yeah, I think probably I haven't said very much about the gay male fashion designers, although you mentioned that earlier. I do have a chapter on how gay men have constructed the fashion industry, and part of what they've constructed is these shoes. There's no question. And the men who designed the most horrifying shoes were gay men, who probably also wear them themselves in drag and so on. So in the book, though, I didn't say anything about drag, and that's another big change, Marian. You were saying what's changed is that as a result of RuPaul's Drag Race 2010, there's been an explosion of the mainstreaming of drag, really misogynistic and horrifying portrayals of women, these extremes of these harmful beauty practices that are now reaching children with drag queen story hour and drag kids and so on. I have written about that in the book I've just done, Penile Imperialism. I didn't write that in Beauty and Misogyny because that hadn't happened. If I were to write the book again, I'd not just have a chapter on gay male fashion designers' horrifying misogyny, but I would also have to run that into a discussion of drag and the way that gay men now, through the practice of drag, are influencing culture and enforcing those very harmful practices upon women. But you were also saying, what do we do? Somebody in the chat just said something about designing clothes for women, women design clothes for women. I can remember back in the day, we used to talk about how it would be nice if we could easily buy lesbian knickers. Now, lesbian knickers are comfortable knickers which clothe a particular part of the body and are not, skin tight and not designed for anybody's excitement. And it was quite difficult to acquire lesbian knickers. You have to search. Today, you have to search hard to find lesbian knickers. And we used to talk at the time how nice it would be if there was an actual lesbian clothes shop. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Which sold dignified, loose clothes in non-garish colors and so on. It would be lovely, but of course there aren't lesbian clothes shops. That still hasn't happened. But yes, well, why are we even talking about this? Why do we have to talk about lesbian clothes shop with the assumption that heterosexual men will still have the terrible problem of finding clothes? I mean, go into any department store and you walk in the women's section, which is supposedly women's fashion, and the materials are cheap, the colors are absolutely awful, the clothes show huge areas of the body. It's horrifying to think that women have to try and clothe themselves in that space, whereas men have clothes that last, and so on and so on. So yes, we need huge changes. What's going to happen? Well, we are just at the beginnings, so far as one can tell, of a new wave of feminism. A women's liberation movement is really beginning. I mean, it's gone a lot further in Korea, of course, but it is happening. And I'm hoping that women will start to question all of these practices on a big scale again. There's a lot of women entrepreneurs now on the net. Maybe we can have some comfortable knickers, comfortable clothing, choices for women. Maybe a cultural revolution can begin again, which can give women dignity, safety, the possibility of having comfortable clothing. So I'm going to be a little bit optimistic about the possibility that that can happen, because there's a lot going on at the moment. But we're because there hasn't been this critique, we're still in this stage where women are talking about choice. And I mean, it's extraordinary to me.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten into the horrors of female genital mutilation, and I think everybody knows how horrible they are. I hope, and I think you've gotten across that that's the horrifying end of a continuum that starts with what seem to be more benign practices. But in the last few minutes, is there anything that anything else that you think we should know, or that you were trying to get across in the book that we may not have touched on?
Well, in terms of what I was trying to get across, I guess what is still astonishing to me, and I find it hard to understand, is that the degrading nature of women's clothing and appearance requirements compared with men is so very, very clear. I mean, if you're walking in the street and you've got a heterosexual couple coming back from a club or whatever, the women can't walk. They're in tiny little bits of clothing. The girls usually don't even wear coats, because I suppose that covers their body and they have to show their body, whereas the men usually look warm, they have flat shoes. This is so obvious, and it so obviously represents the subordination of women, that I don't really understand why people cannot see it. I do think it's really, really, really clear to me that we cannot have the liberation of women whilst these practices remain. I'm sorry, but we really cannot. So the change has got to start happening on the ground. We cannot have one whole half of the population, humiliated in public places in this way, and expect women to be able to have dignity and authority in public life and in politics, to be safe on the streets, and so on and so on and so on.
When you said humiliated in this way, that is such a bugbear for women who do these practices, and is as soon as you say that any of it is humiliating, there's usually this great hue and cry, and just like refusal to listen further, that these practices are humiliating. I mean, they're humiliating because men instituted them to be sexually excited. So to support women, to get them to realize that that's what's happening, and that they are being humiliated by these practices, I think takes really a loving community that we just don't have anymore.
Yes, that's right. I mean, right now, we don't have community. We don't have a women's community. We don't have women's centers. We don't have women's dances. We don't have women's anything. We don't have lesbian spaces. Lesbians are pretty much being erased. So we have to create that community, because it's in that community, as women come into that community, that they realize they can take the shoes off and cut the hair and so on. It was that community that enabled us to do all of those things. But we are so separated now, it's very difficult to know how we're going to kickstart these huge changes.
Yeah, and that's the point I was making about, like, at women's dorms, when they really were just all women, by mid-semester, the women changed in terms of, and this, virtually all straight women, mostly straight women, changed how they were interacting with each other, how they dressed, what they didn't do. I was recently at a big camping kind of festival, and it was just women, no males, not even kids. And it didn't take very long for women to just start like, roaming around practically in pajamas to sit around the campfire. When women are in all women spaces, things change. And I think if there were more of them, that might be kind of like guerrilla warfare to fight these practices.
We have to make these spaces. I want that freedom and that comfort for women. I have a passion that women can have that freedom of comfort. Freedom of movement is the absolute basis. If you don't have your feet on the ground, then there's no possibility of comfort in life.
Right. Thank you. I read the book when it first came out, and when Joe asked me to kind of host this week, I read it again in a week, and it was a good week. Rereading it again, and I'm glad you wrote it, and I'm glad that women are here thinking about it and talking about it, and hope that each woman here kind of goes out and talks to other women, one woman at a time. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Marian, for doing all of this with me. It's been lovely to talk to you. As always, across the pond. Yeah. Thank you. And thanks for being up in the middle of the night. It's all right. I was awake anyway. Joe is still along. I don't know if she has anything she would like to add, but I think we've had a good chat.
I'll just say thank you very much. It was completely brilliant. And to everyone here, you can use the same link for next week. We're going to do the same thing every week. Well, different content. But thank you so much to Sheila and Marian and everybody. And we'll put this up on YouTube quite soon, so you can see it again. And then we're going to share it. So sharing it's got to be good because there's so much brilliant stuff. Okay, see you all next week. Bye.
Bye-bye.